know they took their boots. That's pink boots for Lily, blue boots for Jack.
The silence was so complete that family members began conducting their own investigations. Darren Getz, who had been vocal about his theories from the beginning, started sharing information that painted a very different picture of what law enforcement was actually doing. While the public was told about search operations and ongoing investigations, Darren revealed that the real focus was on the family itself. This shift from search to investigation should have been announced publicly. In most missing children cases, when the focus moves from finding lost children to investigating potential foul play, families and communities are informed. Press conferences are held, new strategies are explained, public assistance is requested in different ways. But not here. The shift happened quietly, behind the scenes, while the public was still being told that search operations were ongoing. This deception suggests that law enforcement was more concerned with managing public perception than with actually finding the children. By the time the search was officially scaled back, many observers had already concluded that it was never meant to find Lily and Jack. It was meant to provide cover while investigators pursued other leads, other theories, other suspects. The children weren't lost in the woods. They were hidden by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. This realization should have been a turning point in the case. If the children weren't lost, if they had been taken by someone with knowledge and planning, then the investigation should have shifted dramatically. Resources should have been redirected, new strategies should have been implemented, different questions should have been asked. Instead, the case seemed to stagnate. Updates became even less frequent. Public interest began to wane. The massive search operation that had captivated the province for a week gradually faded from headlines, replaced by other stories, other tragedies, other mysteries. But for those who were paying attention, for those who understood what the search operation really represented, the scaling back wasn't a defeat. It was confirmation that they had been right all along. The children weren't in the woods. They never had been. And law enforcement had known it from the beginning. The question now became, if not in the woods, then where? If not lost, then taken by whom? And if investigators had suspected family involvement from day one, why hadn't they been more aggressive in pursuing those leads? The answers to these questions would begin to emerge through the testimony of someone who had been watching the morning of May 2nd, someone who had seen things that didn't match the official narrative, someone whose observations would change everything about how this case was understood. If you're still following this investigation, hit that subscribe button now, because what you're about to hear will challenge everything you thought you knew about that morning. Everything changed when Janie McCann decided to speak. For weeks, the morning of May 2nd had been reconstructed through second-hand accounts, official statements, and carefully managed information releases. But Janie had been there. She had seen things with her own eyes. And what she saw that morning didn't match the story that was being told to the public. Janie McCann wasn't just any witness. She was Daniel Martel's mother, which meant she was living in the same house where Lily and Jack were staying. She was part of the inner circle, someone who had access to the family dynamics, the tensions, the conversations that outsiders never heard. When she finally spoke about what she witnessed that morning, it wasn't just testimony, it was an explosion that shattered the official narrative. According to Janie's account, the morning of May 2nd began with conflict. She described waking up to shouting, to voices raised in anger, to the kind of argument that makes everyone in the house uncomfortable. The disagreement was between Malaya and Daniel, and it was serious enough that it couldn't be ignored or explained away. But what makes Janie's testimony so significant isn't just that there was an argument, it's the timing. This wasn't a fight that happened hours before the children went missing. This was happening in the immediate lead-up to their disappearance. The argument was part of the same sequence of events that would end with Lily and Jack vanishing without a trace. Think about what this means for the timeline that had been presented to the public. The official version suggested that the children simply wandered off during what should have been a normal morning routine. But Janie's account reveals that the morning was anything but normal. It was chaotic, tense, filled with the kind of stress that makes rational decision-making nearly impossible. Janie described seeing Malaya during and after this argument, and what she observed was deeply troubling. According to her account, Malaya appeared to be in a state of extreme distress. She wasn't just upset, she was frantic, desperate. exhibiting behavior that suggested someone in the grip of a serious crisis. This observation aligns perfectly with what we know about Malaya's mental state at the time. She was dealing with postpartum depression, the trauma of her relationship with Cody, the stress of the CPS investigation, and now a serious conflict with her current partner. For someone already struggling with multiple stressors, this argument might have been the breaking point. But Janie's testimony goes beyond just describing the argument. She provided specific details about what she saw Malaya doing in the aftermath of the conflict. According to her account, Malaya's behavior was so unusual, so out of character, that it stood out even in the context of an already tense situation. The most significant detail in Janie's testimony relates to timing. She was able to provide a much more precise timeline of events than had been available before. Her account suggests that the period between the argument and the discovery that the children were missing was much shorter than previously believed. This compressed timeline changes everything about how we understand what happened that morning. If Janie is correct, then there was very little time for the children to have wandered off on their own. The window for them to have gotten lost in the woods becomes so narrow that it's almost impossible to believe that's what actually happened. Instead, Janie's timeline suggests that whatever happened to Lily and Jack was immediate, decisive, and planned. There wasn't time for them to gradually wander away from the house and get lost. Something happened quickly, something that removed them from the scene almost immediately after the argument ended. But perhaps the most explosive aspect of Janie's testimony was what she said about Malaya's behavior after the children were discovered to be missing. According to her account, Malaya didn't react the way a mother whose children had just disappeared should react. Her response was wrong, inappropriate, suspicious in ways that made even her own family members uncomfortable. Janie described Malaya as being more concerned with avoiding questions than with finding her children. Instead of frantically searching, instead of calling for help, instead of doing the things that desperate mothers do when their children are missing, Malaya seemed focused on managing her own situation. This observation is particularly damning because it comes from someone who wanted to believe in Malaya's innocence. Janie wasn't a hostile witness looking to cause trouble. She was a family member who had been living in the same house, who had been part of the support system. If she was troubled by what she saw, it suggests that Malaya's behavior was genuinely suspicious. The details of Janie's testimony haven't been fully released to the public, but the implications are clear. She saw things that morning that convinced her that the official story about the children wandering off was false. She witnessed behavior that suggested advanced planning, guilty knowledge, and a level of deception that extended far beyond simply covering up an accident. But there's another layer to Janie's testimony that makes it even more significant. She wasn't just describing what she saw, she was describing what she heard. According to her account, there were conversations, phone calls, and discussions that happened that morning that provide crucial context for understanding what actually occurred. These conversations allegedly reveal that Malaya had been in contact with people outside the immediate household. She had been making arrangements, having discussions, potentially coordinating with others in ways that suggest advanced planning rather than spontaneous decision-making. If Janie's testimony is accurate, then the disappearance of Lily and Jack Sullivan wasn't a tragic accident or a moment of panic. It was the execution of a plan that had been developing for some time. The argument that morning might have been the trigger, but the response was too organized, too efficient, too successful to have been improvised. This revelation transforms the entire case. Instead of looking for children who might have gotten lost, investigators should have been looking for children who had been deliberately hidden. Instead of searching the woods, they should have been tracing phone calls, following money trails, mapping the network of people who might have helped execute such a plan. But here's what makes Janie's testimony even more disturbing. If she's right, if she witnessed evidence of planning and coordination, then law enforcement has had this information for months. They've known that this wasn't an accident. They've known that it wasn't about children wandering off. They've known that it was about deliberate concealment. The question becomes, what did they do with this information? How did they follow up on Janie's observations? And why hasn't any of this been shared with the public? The silence around Janie's testimony is almost as significant as the testimony itself. In most missing children cases, witness accounts are crucial pieces of evidence that help guide the investigation and inform the public. But in this case, One of the most important witness accounts has been buried, hidden, treated as if it doesn't exist. This suggests that what Janie saw that morning was too explosive, too damaging, too politically sensitive to be shared publicly. It points toward conclusions that law enforcement either can't or won't pursue. And it raises the disturbing possibility that the truth about what happened to Lily and Jack Sullivan is being deliberately concealed. As we dig deeper into this case, we're going to examine the physical evidence that supports Janie's testimony, the inconsistencies in the official story that her account helps explain, and the implications of what she witnessed for understanding what really happened to two young children on that chaotic morning in May. Don't go anywhere, because what we're about to reveal will show you that the evidence was hiding in plain sight all along, waiting for someone brave enough to tell the truth about what they saw. Physical evidence in missing children cases usually tells a clear story. Footprints, DNA, disturbed vegetation, personal belongings. These pieces of evidence create a trail that investigators can follow, a roadmap that leads to answers. But in the case of Lily and Jack Sullivan, the physical evidence does something far more disturbing. It reveals that the story we've been told is built on lies. The search teams that scoured the area around the Martell home were looking for signs that two young children had passed through the dense forest. Given the terrain, muddy from recent rain, soft earth that should have held impressions, undergrowth that would have been disturbed by small bodies pushing through, finding evidence of the children's passage should have been straightforward. But they found nothing. No footprints leading away from the house. No broken branches at child height. No pieces of clothing caught on thorns. No signs that Lily and Jack had ever entered the woods at all. This absence of evidence is significant in itself, but it becomes even more troubling when you consider what investigators did find. According to reports, there were adult footprints in the area, prints that suggested people had been walking through the woods, but these prints didn't match the pattern you'd expect if adults had been searching for lost children. The footprints they found were too organized, too purposeful, too strategic. They weren't the chaotic, desperate tracks of people frantically searching for missing children. They were the measured, deliberate prints of people who knew exactly where they were going and why. Think about what this means. If Lily and Jack had wandered into the woods on their own, their footprints would have been found. Children that age don't walk carefully. They run, they stumble, they leave clear evidence of their passage. The fact that no such evidence was found strongly suggests that the children never entered the woods at all. But if the children didn't go into the woods, then where did they go? And whose footprints were investigators actually finding? According to Darren Getz, the family-connected source who has provided information throughout this investigation, the footprints tell a different story entirely. They suggest that adults were in the woods that morning, but not to search for lost children. They were there to create the impression that a search was necessary, to establish the false narrative that would confuse investigators and buy time for the real plan to unfold. This theory is supported by the pattern of the footprints themselves. Instead of radiating outward from the house in the way search patterns typically develop, the adult prints seem to follow specific routes, almost as if they were following a predetermined plan rather than responding to an emergency. The timing of these footprints is also significant. Based on the depth of the impressions and the way they interacted with the mud and debris, investigators determined that they were made on the morning of May 2nd, the same morning the children disappeared. This wasn't evidence of previous searches or unrelated activity. These were prints made during the same time frame as the disappearance. But here's where the story gets even more troubling. The adult footprints weren't just random. They matched shoes that belonged to people who had been in the house that morning. Investigators were able to identify at least some of the prints as belonging to individuals who were part of the immediate family circle, people who had access to the children, and who would have known their routines. This revelation changes everything about how we understand the morning of May 2nd. Instead of children wandering off and adults later searching for them, the evidence suggests that adults were in the woods first, possibly setting up the false narrative that would be used to explain the children's disappearance. But the footprint evidence isn't the only physical evidence that contradicts the official story. There were also inconsistencies in the timeline that became apparent only when investigators began examining the scene more carefully. According to multiple sources, the initial search of the house and immediate area was surprisingly superficial. Rooms that should have been thoroughly examined were given only cursory attention. Areas where children might have been hiding were left unchecked. The search seemed designed more to establish that the children weren't there than to actually find them. This approach is highly unusual in missing children cases. Standard protocol requires exhaustive searches of the home and immediate area before expanding outward. The fact that this didn't happen suggests that investigators either knew the children weren't there or had been directed to avoid finding them. The superficial nature of the initial search becomes even more suspicious when you consider that it was followed by the elaborate woods search that we know was ultimately unsuccessful. Resources that should have been used to conduct a thorough investigation of the home and family were instead devoted to searching terrain that physical evidence suggested the children had never entered. But perhaps the most damning piece of physical evidence relates to the children's belongings. In cases where children wander off, they typically leave behind clear evidence of their departure. Toys dropped along the way, shoes that come off, clothing that gets caught on branches. These items create a trail that can be followed. In the Sullivan case, investigators found none of these telltale signs. The children's personal belongings were either missing entirely or arranged in ways that suggested they had been packed rather than abandoned. This evidence points toward a planned departure rather than an accidental wandering. The lack of physical evidence supporting the lost in the woods theory became so apparent that even the search teams began to question what they were being asked to do. According to unofficial reports, some searchers expressed doubt about the validity of the operation, suggesting that they were being used to provide cover for an investigation that was actually focused elsewhere. This doubt among the searchers themselves is significant because these are trained professionals who understand what evidence of lost children should look like. Their skepticism suggests that the disconnect between the official narrative and the physical reality was so obvious that it couldn't be ignored. But the most troubling aspect of the physical evidence isn't what was found, it's what wasn't preserved. According to sources close to the investigation, crucial evidence from the morning of May 2nd was either inadequately documented or lost entirely. Photos that should have been taken weren't captured. Measurements that should have been recorded were never made. Chain of custody procedures that should have been followed were ignored. This failure to preserve evidence is particularly suspicious in a case of this magnitude. The disappearance of 2 young children should have triggered the most careful and thorough evidence collection procedures. The fact that this didn't happen suggests either incompetence on a massive scale or deliberate obstruction of the investigation. As we examine the evidence more closely, we begin to see a pattern of deception that extends far beyond the morning of May 2nd. The physical evidence doesn't just contradict the official story, it reveals a level of planning and coordination that suggests this disappearance was anything but spontaneous. The footprints, the timeline inconsistencies, the missing belongings, the superficial searches, all of these point toward a conclusion that law enforcement seems reluctant to embrace. Lily and Jack Sullivan didn't wander off. They were taken. And the people who took them knew exactly what they were doing. But to understand who might have been capable of such an elaborate deception, we need to look more closely at the behavior of the people who were supposed to be protecting these children. We need to examine the actions and reactions of those who were closest to Lily and Jack, particularly their mother, whose behavior in the aftermath of their disappearance raised questions that have never been adequately answered. Keep watching, because what we're about to reveal about Malaya's actions will make you question everything you thought you knew about this case. The most damning evidence against Malaya Brooks Murray isn't what she did, it's how she acted. In the crucial hours and days following the disappearance of Lily and Jack, when every moment mattered, when a mother's natural instincts should have taken over, Malaya's behavior was so inappropriate, so suspicious, that it convinced even those who wanted to believe in her innocence that something was terribly wrong. The first red flag appeared within hours of the children being reported missing. Instead of the frantic searching, the desperate phone calls, the emotional breakdown that characterizes mothers of missing children, Malaya seemed strangely composed. She wasn't crying. She wasn't organizing search parties. She wasn't calling every person she knew to ask for help. Instead, according to multiple witnesses, she seemed more concerned with managing her own situation than with finding her children. She was making phone calls, but not to people who could help search. She was having conversations, but not about where Lily and Jack might be. She was taking actions, but not the actions of a desperate mother. This behavior was so out of character, so inconsistent with normal maternal instincts, that it immediately raised suspicions among those who witnessed it. Janie McCann, Daniel's mother, was particularly disturbed by what she saw. According to her account, Malaya seemed to know something about the children's disappearance that she wasn't sharing. But the most explosive revelation about Malaya's behavior came from an unexpected source: the school. According to reports, on the morning of May 2nd, before the children were even reported missing, Malaya called the school to inform them that Lily and Jack would not be attending classes that day. Think about the implications of this phone call. If the children had simply wandered off, if their disappearance was accidental, why would Malaya call the school to excuse their absence? How would she have known, hours before they were reported missing, that they wouldn't be in class? This phone call suggests advanced knowledge of the children's disappearance. It indicates that Malaya knew, before anyone else was aware there was a problem, that Lily and Jack would not be following their normal routine. This isn't the behavior of a surprised mother, it's the behavior of someone executing a plan. The timing of this call is particularly significant because it occurred before the argument that Janie McCann described, before the chaos that supposedly led to the children wandering off. This suggests that whatever happened to Lily and Jack was planned well in advance, not a spontaneous reaction to family conflict. But the school call was just the beginning of a pattern of suspicious behavior that would continue for days. According to sources close to the investigation, Malaya's actions in the immediate aftermath of the disappearance were consistently inconsistent with those of an innocent mother. While search teams were being organized, while volunteers were gathering, while law enforcement was coordinating their response, Malaya was noticeably absent from much of the activity. She wasn't leading the charge to find her children. She wasn't providing crucial information to investigators. She wasn't doing any of the things that mothers of missing children typically do. Instead, she seemed to be focused on protecting herself. She was careful about what she said, selective about what information she shared, strategic about who she spoke with. This behavior is understandable if you're guilty of something, but it's incomprehensible if your children are genuinely missing and you're desperate to find them. The contrast between Malaya's behavior and that of other family members was stark. While relatives and friends were organizing search parties, posting flyers, reaching out to media, Malaya remained in the background, present but not participating, visible but not engaged. This detachment became even more pronounced as the investigation progressed. According to sources, Malaya became increasingly unavailable to investigators, harder to reach, less cooperative with official requests for information. She seemed to be withdrawing from the very investigation that should have been her highest priority. But perhaps the most damning aspect of Malaya's behavior was what happened when she was finally interviewed by investigators. According to reports, her statements were inconsistent, her timeline was confused, and her emotional responses were inappropriate for someone whose children were missing. When pressed for details about the morning of May 2nd, Malaya allegedly provided contradictory information about times, activities, and conversations. These inconsistencies weren't minor details, they were fundamental aspects of the timeline that should have been seared into her memory if she was truly an innocent mother experiencing every parent's worst nightmare. The emotional inconsistencies were even more troubling. According to sources who witnessed these interviews, Malaya's effect was flat, her responses were mechanical, and her overall demeanor suggested someone who was more concerned with avoiding consequences than with finding her children. This behavior pattern extended beyond the immediate aftermath of the disappearance. According to multiple sources, Malaya seemed to have information about the children's whereabouts that she wasn't sharing. She made statements that suggested she knew they were safe, that she wasn't worried about their immediate welfare, that she expected them to be found. These statements are particularly significant because they occurred at a time when any innocent mother would have been terrified about her children's safety. If Lily and Jack had truly wandered off into dangerous terrain, if they were genuinely lost and in peril, no mother would have been calm about their prospects for survival. But Malaya's statements suggested that she wasn't worried about the children being hurt, being hungry, being cold, or being afraid. She seemed to know that they were in a safe place, being cared for, protected from harm. This knowledge is impossible to explain if the children had truly wandered off randomly. The most disturbing aspect of Malaya's behavior wasn't any single action. It was the cumulative effect of all her actions together. Each individual behavior might have been explained away, but the pattern they created was unmistakable. This wasn't the behavior of an innocent mother. This was the behavior of someone who knew exactly what had happened to her children and was working to prevent that information from becoming public. But there's one more piece of evidence about Malaya's behavior that ties everything together, that provides the final confirmation of what many had suspected from the beginning. According to sources, after the search was scaled back, after the investigation shifted focus, after the media attention began to wane, Malaya herself disappeared. She left the area, cut off contact with family members, and became effectively unreachable. For someone whose children were supposedly missing, for someone who should have been desperate to maintain contact with investigators, this disappearance is inexplicable, unless she knew something about where her children were that made her own presence unnecessary. The pattern of behavior, the suspicious phone calls, the inconsistent statements, the emotional detachment, and finally the disappearance itself all point toward one inescapable conclusion. Malaya Brooks Murray wasn't the victim of a tragic accident. She was the architect of a plan that successfully removed her children from a situation she perceived as threatening. Understanding this conclusion is crucial because it changes everything about how we should view this case. If Malaya orchestrated the disappearance of her children, then we're not looking at a tragedy. We're looking at a desperate act of maternal protection that might actually offer hope for Lily and Jack's survival. But to understand why this conclusion should give us hope rather than despair, we need to examine what it means for the children's current situation and what it suggests about their prospects for being found alive and well. After 8 weeks of searching, after countless theories and false leads, after months of investigation and speculation, we arrive at a conclusion that should fundamentally change how we think about the disappearance of Lily and Jack Sullivan. The evidence, when examined carefully and objectively, points toward a truth that is both disturbing and hopeful. These children weren't lost, they weren't kidnapped by strangers, and they weren't harmed by predators. They were hidden by people who love them. This conclusion, supported by the physical evidence, the witness testimony, the behavioral patterns, and the investigative failures, transforms this case from a tragedy into something entirely different. If Malaya Brooks Murray orchestrated the disappearance of her children, if she worked with others to place them somewhere safe, if she made the desperate decision to choose separation over the risk of losing them to the system, then Lily and Jack are likely alive, cared for, and protected. The evidence supporting this conclusion is overwhelming when viewed collectively. The lack of physical evidence in the woods, the adult footprints that suggested planning rather than searching, the suspicious behavior of key family members, the school phone call that indicated advanced knowledge, the failed search operation that seemed designed to provide cover rather than find children, all of these pieces fit together to create a picture of deliberate concealment rather than accidental loss. But perhaps the most compelling evidence is the consistent belief among nearly everyone connected to this case that the children are still alive. This isn't wishful thinking or desperate hope. It's the assessment of people who have access to information that hasn't been made public, who understand the family dynamics, who know things about this case that the rest of us can only speculate about. The theory that Lily and Jack were taken to a First Nations reserve, while politically sensitive and jurisdictionally complex, makes perfect sense in the context of Malaya's fears and the resources available to her. Reserves provide not just geographic isolation but cultural protection, community support, and legal complexity that makes investigation difficult for outside authorities. The raid on Millbrook Reserve that occurred at 4:24 a.m. suggests that law enforcement took this possibility seriously enough to act on it. The complete silence about the results of that raid suggests either that they found evidence too sensitive to share publicly, or that they discovered leads pointing to an even more complex network of protection. If the children are being protected by Indigenous communities, then they're likely receiving not just physical care but cultural education and support that Indigenous families have provided for generations. They would be safe not just from physical harm, but from the cultural erosion that Malaya feared would result from state intervention. This protection wouldn't be temporary, it would be sustainable. Indigenous communities have generations of experience in protecting their children from outside interference. They have systems, resources, and networks that could keep Lily and Jack safe indefinitely while legal and political solutions are pursued. The fact that law enforcement has been unable to locate the children after months of investigation supports this theory. These aren't children who are being held by amateurs or criminals. They're being protected by people who understand how to keep families together in the face of state interference, who have been doing this work for generations. But this conclusion also suggests something hopeful about the prospects for resolution. If the children are being protected rather than harmed, then finding them becomes a matter of negotiation rather than rescue. Instead of racing against time to save them from danger, authorities could be working to address the underlying fears that led to their concealment. This would require acknowledging that the child protection system failed Malaya Brooks Murray, that her fears were based on legitimate historical and contemporary concerns, that her actions were those of a desperate mother rather than a criminal. It would require recognizing that the solution isn't punishment, but rather systemic change that addresses the root causes of her fear. The path forward would involve working with Indigenous communities, respecting their sovereignty and their child protection systems, and finding ways to reunite the family that don't involve criminalizing the very people who sought to protect these children. It would require understanding that this case isn't about law enforcement versus criminals. It's about competing systems of child protection with different values and different approaches. If this theory is correct, then the continued investigation focus on criminal prosecution rather than family reunification is counterproductive. It reinforces the very fears that led to the children's concealment in the first place. It suggests that the system hasn't learned from its failures and isn't willing to change its approach. The truth about Lily and Jack Sullivan might be that they're safer now than they were before their disappearance. They might be receiving better care, more cultural education, and more community support than they would have received in the system that was investigating their welfare. They might be protected not just from immediate harm, but from the long-term trauma that affects so many Indigenous children who are removed from their families. This doesn't mean that their separation from their mother and their established family isn't traumatic. It doesn't mean that the current situation is ideal or sustainable. But it does mean that the children are likely alive, safe, and cared for by people who understand the stakes involved in their protection. The resolution of this case depends on authorities being willing to approach it as a family reunification issue rather than a criminal investigation. It depends on recognizing that the fear that drove Malaya's actions was rational and based on legitimate concerns about the child protection system. It depends on acknowledging that Indigenous communities have been protecting their children for generations and that this protection might be the best option available given the circumstances. If law enforcement continues to pursue this case as a criminal matter, if they maintain their focus on punishment rather than reunification, then Lily and Jack Sullivan might remain hidden indefinitely. But if authorities are willing to address the underlying issues, if they're willing to work with Indigenous communities on their terms, if they're willing to acknowledge that this case represents a failure of the child protection system rather than a criminal act, then there's hope for a resolution that brings these children back to their family while addressing the concerns that led to their concealment. The story of Lily and Jack Sullivan isn't over. These children are likely alive, safe, and protected. The question now is whether the system that failed them initially will be willing to change its approach to bring them home. The answer to that question will determine not just the fate of these two children, but the future of how child protection operates in Indigenous communities across Canada. The truth that gives hope is that love, desperate, determined, protective love, might have saved these children from a fate that their mother viewed as worse than separation. If we're willing to acknowledge that truth, if we're willing to work with that love rather than against it, then Lily and Jack Sullivan might still come home. Thank you for following Lily and Jack's story to the end. If this case moved you, if it challenged your assumptions about missing children investigations, if it helped you understand the complex realities facing Indigenous families, then hit that like button and subscribe. We have more stories that deserve to be heard, more truths that need to be told, more mysteries that demand answers. Share your thoughts, your theories, and your hopes for these children in the comments below. Do you believe they're alive and protected? Do you think the system can change enough to bring them home? Your voice matters in keeping this story alive, in demanding answers, in holding authorities accountable for finding solutions that prioritize children's welfare over institutional convenience. The search for Lily and Jack Sullivan continues, but it's not a search through forests and fields. It's a search for justice, for understanding, for a system that protects children by supporting families rather than destroying them. That search needs your voice, your engagement, your refusal to let this story disappear into the bureaucratic silence that has characterized it from the beginning. These children deserve to come home. Their story deserves to be told. And the truth deserves to be heard, no matter how uncomfortable it might be for those who prefer simple narratives to complex realities.